Okay, so now we begin the investigation of the last theorist that we're going to study in this course, Robert Nozick, and here's a photo of him. Now, immediately you can see that there's a problem. The man's far too good looking to be a philosopher. He obviously should have been a movie star, but anyway, there you go. Now, Nozick also advances social contract arguments, like we've seen many of the theorists that we've studied do. So his general aim is to show how government can be legitimate, and importantly, what the limits of legitimate government are. That's a central focus. In that way, he's quite similar to Locke. He's trying to figure out what government can legitimately do and what it can't legitimately do, what the limits of legitimate government are. Now, as I say, he advances a social contract argument in this regard, and with all social contract arguments, he begins by asking what the world would look like without government. And the jargon for that, as you'll remember, is the state of nature. What is the state of nature like? And we've seen various answers to this question, right? So with Hobbes, you'll remember Hobbes thought that the state of nature was a state of war, the state of war of all against all, like where life was nasty, poor, brutish and short. Whereas Locke thought that although there were problems in the state of nature was a state of perfect freedom. Now, Nozick says, look, I want to do something a little bit different than Hobbes and Locke. I want to be completely realistic about what a state of nature would be like. I'm not asking these kind of metaphysical questions about the state of nature. I just want to know what would actually happen if, say, government just disappeared tomorrow. What would happen? What would actually happen in a world like that, where government just disappeared tomorrow? And he says, we can answer this question in two ways. One is we can just think about it, this sort of armchair analysis. You just sort of sit there and think, what would happen if government disappeared tomorrow? But another way is to look at countries in which government has disappeared, or at least to a large extent disappeared, and see what happens in them. And he's thinking of countries like, the particular countries that we're going to talk about, Eastern European countries after the fall of communism. So what happened in there? Now, it's not true that the government completely disappeared in those countries, but the idea is that can give us some kind of insight as to what the state of nature might be like. Okay, so he's trying to look at what would actually happen. And his major claim about what would actually happen is that things would be very inefficient in such a state. Now that's a pretty weak word for capturing what the problem is in the state of nature, inefficiency. But let's just use that term, the term that he uses. Things would be inefficient. Now, what's the problem? What's the source of this inefficiency? The problem is, and this is also a problem noticed by Hobbes, the problem is that in the state of nature, I wouldn't be able to do much because I'd always be having to worry about the stuff that I had. So, for example, if I wake up tomorrow and there's no government, then, I've got to worry about my house and someone might come and nick my guitars, or my car might get stolen, right? So I've got to worry about that. At the moment, I can be reasonably confident that police protection is going to protect these things, at least reasonably confident. But if the police don't exist anymore, then I've got to look after these things myself. And so I'm just going to have to stay here, it's kind of like what this year has been like. I'm just going to have to stay here in my house, right, and protect what I have from being stolen or wrecked or vandalized or whatever by other people. And this is extremely inefficient because it means that I can't do anything, right? I can't go out shopping, I can't go to work, I can't go and visit people, I can't do anything because I've always got to be here looking after my stuff. And so Nozick says that in this situation, if we all found ourselves in this situation, what we would do over time is that we would form some kind of protective associations. So, for example, I might, I want to do things. I've got to go out and get some food. I want to go out and see my friends and so on. I've got stuff to do. And so what I might do is I might enter into an arrangement with my neighbour where, say, for example, I'll look after my stuff and my neighbour's stuff on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and my neighbours can look after my stuff on Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. You get the idea, right? So we might enter into some kind of arrangement where we split the work, right? So I get to go out and do other things than just look after my stuff because my neighbour's looking after my stuff half the time. Okay, and that's an improvement. You can see that that's an improvement because all of a sudden I've now got the ability to do other things than just sit around here looking after my stuff. But still, this isn't very efficient either. I mean, for one thing, I'm not very good at looking after stuff. I mean, if people came around here and tried to steal stuff, what would I do? I mean, I'd just, now, of course, I'd call the police. But there aren't any police in the society that, in the state that we're imagining, in the state of nature. So there's not much that I could do. What could I do? Chase after them with a spade or something? I don't know. Right? So, and what's more, I'm still only freed up for half the time. So what he thinks we would do over a period of time is that some of us would tend to develop as professional protectors. Okay, that would become their kind of profession. In other words, we would develop a division of labour. Right? Some of us would become protectors and some of us would do other things. Okay, so, people who are sort of big and strong and good at fighting or whatever, or good with using firearms or whatever it would be, they would be the ones that we would choose to protect our stuff, and we would pay them somehow, right? I mean, of course, we've got to imagine we're in a state of nature, so there wouldn't be necessarily be money as we know it. But, I might, for example, spend most of my time producing some kind of products, some kind of goods. Maybe it would be food, or for example, and I would pay the protector in food. So now I could actually work 5 days a week or whatever I wanted to work and to produce 7 days a week and produce food, and I could give some of this food to the protector, and that would be a much more efficient system. We would have a fully developed division of labour there. Okay. All right, and he says, if you look and see the way societies actually develop when there's been a collapse of government, this is what happens, right? People do feel a need to protect themselves from other people, and they form protective associations of this kind. And the kind of places that he's thinking of, as I mentioned before, one might think of Eastern Europe, particularly Russia or the Soviet Union after the fall of the Soviet government. Various protective associations were formed. One might think of Sicily during the dominance of the mafia in Sicily, whereas mafia is exactly what it is, right? A protective association. In fact, you have people that you pay protection money to, right? Or sir, would you like someone to look after your car with the right with the hidden threat being if you don't, it'll get wrecked. So yes, okay, so you pay money to that person to look after your car. It's protection money, right? And so this is exactly what happened in Sicily. So I might use this lecture as an excuse for rewatching The Godfather, for example, although that's not set in Italy or Sicily. It is at the beginning, but only at the beginning. In fact, I haven't watched it for ages. I think we've got to watch it tonight, just as it happens, because my kids are keen to see it. Anyway, whatever. Okay, so, and another thing happens. So this is what actually happens. People form protective associations. Okay, and then something else happens. And this is, really a reason for watching The Godfather, because it's well brought out there. The other thing that happens is that the protective associations start fighting amongst themselves. Okay, so they try and expand their territory, and they get into territorial conflicts with other protective associations, and they fight. Okay, and you can see that in gang wars and so forth, and in the mafia. And eventually, somebody wins. Right, one of these protective associations wins. And what Nozick says is that when one of those protective associations wins, we call that the state. Right, that's what the state is. It's a somewhat cynical view, I suppose, in a way, but Nozick says that's just realistic. It's what actually happens. Right, protective associations fight. There's a kind of civil war, if you like, within a community, within a grouping of people. Eventually, one of these protective associations wins. That becomes the state. Okay, now, and what the state achieves is what we call a natural monopoly of force. Okay, the state has a natural monopoly of force. And Nozick says that force is the only natural monopoly. That is, for force to actually be good, it has to be a monopoly. It's only good if it's a monopoly. I mean, if you and I are out there coercing everybody, that's bad, right? Force is only good if there is one central organisation we call the state that has control of coercive power within a community. So force is only good if it's captured by a monopoly, and it's the only thing that's good if it's a monopoly. Everything else is better if it's not a monopoly, but force is the only thing that's good if it is a monopoly. So force is a natural monopoly in this sense. It's only good if it is a monopoly, and it's the only monopoly that is good. Okay, so what we get, says Nozick, is a dominant protective association, right? And we call that association the state. Okay, now what I want to do now is I want to present a summary of Nozick's argument. It's going to go way ahead of where we've got to now, but I think it's useful at this point to see a summary of how his argument's going to go, to sort of lay a map for where we're going to be going in the next hour or so. Okay, so here's the summary. We start with the state of nature, and then we have these inefficiencies that we were talking about. Right, this problem about not being able to do anything because I need to protect my own property and stuff. Okay, so we form protective associations, and then those protective associations fight with each other, and there develops a dominant protective association, the natural monopoly of force. Now, Nozick says that most people will be willing to live under this dominant protective association, but there are some people that won't. There'll be some holdouts. These he calls independents. There'll be some holdouts. Now, and what we have to do is we have to incorporate those independents within a society. We can't have a community where we just say, well, not 99.9% of people are under the authority of the state, but there are these people who are just exceptions, outlaws. Literally speaking, outlaws, people outside the law. We can't accept the existence of them, so we have to incorporate them within the society somehow. And Rawls has got a very complicated argument to show how the independents can be incorporated within society that we'll talk about later. But anyway, once we've got those independents incorporated in society, we get our state. And then it's a minimal state. It's a state that can be justified as a result of this argument, and it's a state that has power, but it has very highly circumscribed power. There are only certain things that the state is able to do. Now, the point of this argument is that we're supposed to, what it's supposed to show is how the state can evolve without any violations of individuals' rights. Okay, that's absolutely crucial to Nozick's argument. The state is meant to evolve without there being any violation of anybody's rights. Okay, and he thinks that this is something that other people, except maybe Locke, right, didn't pay enough attention to. Right? If the state is going to be justified, it has to come into existence without violating people's rights, and indeed it has to maintain itself in existence without violating people's rights. So one thing to notice about this is as the state arises out of this war between the protective associations, the state is, on Nozick's view, a kind of protective association. Its fundamental role is to protect us, to protect our rights. Okay, and as a result, for reasons that we'll see in more detail soon, but maybe you can start to see already, because the state is here to protect our rights, it is, by its nature, a minimal state. It's about protecting us, not doing things for us. Okay, it's about protecting us, not doing things for us. So it's a to use the jargon, it's a minimal state. We talk about the minimal state, or sometimes people talk about the night watchman state. It's just another piece of jargon. You know, night watchmen is the guys in medieval Europe who used to walk around at night with a lantern and sometimes with a halberd or something, or a pole arm. That's how they seem to always appear in the movies anyway. And just make sure that everything's okay, right? Their job is to just kind of police things to make sure everything's okay. It's not to help out. It's not to make people's lives go better. It's just to protect people from any nefarious activity that might be occurring at night. In particular, Nozick wants to say that redistribution of wealth is not justified. There's no redistribution of wealth allowed for under the state that Nozick argues for. And why would that be? Because Nozick says the redistribution of wealth necessarily involves the violation of people's rights. In particular, it's the violation of property rights. Now, one thing we have to be careful about here is we live in a world today in which rights talk has become, I'm just going to say this, rights talk has become virtually meaningless because everybody, people claim that they have rights to everything. I have a right to, people will say, I have a right to tertiary education. I have a right to a high standard of living. I have a right to, anything. I mean, the whole human rights agenda has exploded to such a point that the nature of Nozick's argument might not be as clear to us as it would have been clear to people studying it, 20 years ago. The standard answer these days is if you want something, you claim that you've got a human right to it, right? I mean, that's basically the way, you see this on the news or whatever, people making these kinds of arguments all the time, it's not too far away when let's say, for example, one of my sons wants me to buy them an iPad, they'll say they have a human right to an iPad, So what you've got to do is you've got to sort of put all this human rights noise aside, right? And just think, what's Nozick actually talking about here? He's not talking about all this stuff, right? He's talking about, in particular, the idea that we have property rights and taking from one person to give to another is a violation of the property rights of the person whose rights have been taken from. Now, maybe that can be justified if we can find a right in the person who we're distributing the wealth to, right? A right that requires them to receive that wealth. But, says Nozick, you can't just make the right up. You can't just say, I have a human right to get, to be bought an iPad or something. You've got to actually find somewhere in this argument that the existence of that right. You can't just make them up. But you've got to have a proper theory that justifies the existence of the relevant right. And he says you're not going to find one, and we'll see his reasons for thinking that. Okay, so no redistribution will be allowed on Nozick's view. If the state is as nearly all states do, right? If the state is redistributing wealth, then it is acting illegitimately. No taking money for public projects. So no taking money to fund large infrastructure projects or indeed healthcare or anything of the kind, says Nozick. What is justified is protection. That is a police force, defence force, and some other things, but not a lot more. Okay, so what we need to do is to confront this argument now. Why is it that Nozick thinks that the only state that can be justified is a minimal state? why is it that Nozick thinks in particular that redistribution and taking money for public projects cannot be justified? So we might put the question this way: why can't the state engage in projects for the common good? Well, here's Nozick's answer to that question. There is no social entity with a good that undergoes some sacrifice for its own good. There are only individual people, different individual people, with their own individual lives. Using one of these people for the benefit of others uses him and benefits the others, nothing more. Okay. Now, I think this is an extremely powerful argument. Whether it succeeds in demonstrating exactly what Nozick wants it wants to show that it demonstrates is another matter, and that's, of course, as always, something for you to decide, not me. But I think this is, I decide for myself, you decide for yourself. Nevertheless, I think this is a very, very powerful argument, and it's an argument that makes a point that we've really lost sight of, I think, in the modern world. So what Nozick is saying is let's say that, for example, what the government is indeed what this current government does want to do. I mean, it's taking tax, and it's going to increase, and if it wins the forthcoming election, it will increase some tax rates, and it'll increase the top tax rate. Let alone what, say, other political parties such as the Greens want to do, which is increase tax very significantly. What Nozick is saying is what these people want to do is they want to take money from me, say, just using me as an example, to take money from me and spend it on other people. Okay, and it does so. What they want to do, they want to do that because they think it's in the common good. And what Nozick is saying is, look, there's no such thing as the common good. The common good makes it sound as if what's happening is the state is going to take money from me and give it to this other person, and that will benefit everybody, including me. But that's not the truth. That's not what's actually happening. What's happening is the state is taking money from me and giving it to somebody else, which benefits that other person, but it doesn't benefit me, right? And when we talk about the common good, right, we occlude the fact, we hide the fact that what we're doing is we're sacrificing my interests for the benefit of the other person. Okay, now we might think this is justified. That, you may or may not think it's justified. But what Nozick is saying, and this is, I think, the real power of his argument, is that we must not lose sight of this fact that is what we're doing. We are sacrificing one person's interests for the benefit of somebody else. Okay, when we talk about doing it for the common good, that's almost always what we're doing. We're sacrificing one person for the sake of somebody else. Okay? And we mustn't pretend that that's not what we're doing by just saying, oh, it's for the common good, as if everyone benefits. Now, I think that is something that we've lost sight of in the modern, in today's world. Right? We think, just think about, for example, the lockdowns and the restrictions on people's liberty that we've introduced over the COVID crisis. Now, I'm not saying that those things are unjustified, right? So I think some of them are and some of them aren't, right? And I don't want to talk about exactly what and why and so forth. But what I want to point out to you, or what I want to claim, and what I want to ask you to think about is this. It seems to me that today we're very, very happy to sacrifice the interests of some people for the greater good. I mean, when I think of the greater good, I always think of I was going to say Harry Potter, but it's not Harry Potter, is it? It's the subsequent series that's actually a prequel. What is it called? The Crimes of Grindelwald or something? Where everything that this monster does is done for the common good. Right? And I think that's something we should think about. It's something we should think about when Grindelwald starts talking about, in these movies, for the common good, we all recognise that he's a monster, and yet, Jacinda Ardern talks about for the common good all the time too. Now, I'm not saying she's like Grindelwald. That's not the claim. The point is, though, and this best put in the form of a question: have we lost sight of the importance of people here? Right, we're just so willing to sacrifice people for the benefit of others. Now, I'm not saying we should never do that. Nozick is saying we should never do that. I'm not saying we should never do that. I'm not saying we should do it. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying what I would like you to notice is how easily we do it. Right? We don't seem to care very much about doing it in the modern world. And I think this is something that Nozick reminds us of. We should at least be careful about it in a way that I don't think we are careful anymore. Now, let me now relate this discussion to an earlier topic that we were looking at, utilitarianism, because of course the real target of Nozick's theory here is utilitarianism. Well, it's utilitarianism and rules, but we'll come back to that. It's utilitarianism. There was a very influential, I don't think I've talked about this, maybe I have, but there was a very influential utilitarian called Hare, H-A-R-E was his name, R-M, Hare. And he said that the right way to, when you're thinking about social planning, the right thing to do is to just imagine that the society was a single person. And what you do is you just make decisions on the basis that society was a single person. Okay, and what rules, and that may be the context in which I discuss this, what rules and Nozick object to about that is that, as Rawls would say, that fails to take seriously the distinction between persons. Because after all, I might make sacrifice, for example, I discover, as I did the other day, I had I don't know if you could see this. I don't know why I'm doing this, but anyway, this used to be a mole on my arm, and you can see it's not there anymore. There's just a scar. So what happened there? Well, my doctor decided that he should cut the mole out. It was totally benign, as happens, there's no problem, but he should cut the mole out because it may become malignant, and obviously it could kill me. I could get skin cancer and die. And so what I did was I sacrificed the mole for the greater good, for the good of my whole body. And I don't really give a stuff about that. I'm quite happy not to have the mole, no problem. Okay, but if the mole was a person, right, should we just cut it out and chuck it away? Kill it? Just like that? Well, Here's thought experiment would lead you to say, yeah, right, just as you can cut a mole out, right, when it endangers the whole body, you can just cut people out when they endanger the whole body. And for Rawls and Nozick, that's morally hideous, they think, because it fails to take seriously the distinction between persons. But Nozick says, if you think about it, right, although we're not talking about killing people, but we actually do this kind of thing all the time. We take from people to benefit others, right? That's sacrificing their interests for the benefit of others. We do that all the time, and Nozick thinks it's totally unjust when we do it. Now, here, H-E-R-E, here, Nozick is appealing to a principle of justice that was very powerfully enunciated by a German philosopher called Immanuel Kant, and that principle is this one. Okay, it's known as the second formulation of the categorical imperative. I'm sure you've heard of this, even if you haven't read it expressed in quite this language. Now I say that the human being, and in general every rational being, exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. Instead, he must in all his actions, whether directed to himself or also to other rational beings, always be regarded at the same time as an end. Alright, so this is just the idea that you shouldn't use people merely as means to ends. Kant was the philosopher who enunciated this principle. Okay, and the interesting thing about this is we probably all agree to that, with that, right? I mean, unless you're a diehard utilitarian, you probably agree with the idea that people shouldn't be used as means to other people's ends. You shouldn't use people as means to ends. We say that all the time. It's a very common saying. And yet, says Nozick, we do it all the time, right? So we believe that this principle is right, but we violate the principle all the time. You violate the principle every day by agreeing to a system of government that takes people's wealth and gives it to others, for example, because that's just using them as means to other people's ends. Okay, now, as I say, I think this ought to make us uncomfortable. Whether you end up agreeing with Nozick or not, this ought to make us uncomfortable. At the very least, we should be uncomfortable with the ease with which we do this. Right, we just go, oh, high tax rates, yeah, cool. Right, well, we at least should be thinking about the fact that it seems as if when we do this, we are using people as means to others' ends. And we seem ourselves to think that that's unjust. Right, this needs to be at least worked through. Right, we shouldn't be so happy about it. Okay, all right. So that's why Nozick doesn't believe in redistribution. He believes that redistribution of wealth is unjust because it uses people as means to other people's ends. It sacrifices people for the common good, but where the common good is not the good of everyone. Right, it's only the good of the people who are being benefited. Right, it's not the good of the people who are being sacrificed. Okay, and it's important to keep that in mind. Now we need to go on to a different issue. Oh, actually, one thing I want to mention before going on to the different issue is this. Why did Nozick write this book? The book that I've asked you to look at, that book called Anarchy, State and Utopia. And the reason that he wrote the book was because he was really heavily influenced by Rawls, that they were colleagues, Rawls and Nozick. Now, when I say he was heavily influenced by Rawls, I don't mean he agreed with Rawls, because he didn't agree with Rawls. But when Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice, Nozick thought, this is so brilliant and so powerful and so wrong that I have to write a book to respond to it. And that's why he's doing it. And so you can understand in a way, one way of understanding Nozick's argument, one way of understanding Anarchy, State and Utopia is that a reply to the difference principle. Right? It's a response to Rawls's difference principle. Like I think that's a useful way of thinking about Nozick's motivation. Okay, all right. So now we go on to the next topic.